The woman they called worthless saved a dying wolf in the snow. She had no idea that Wolf was an alpha king, or that one act of mercy would shatter her exile, ignite a war, and crown her queen of a realm that had cast her aside. This is her story. Stay until the end to see how the outcast became unstoppable, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. Let's begin. The northern frontier didn't forgive weakness. It didn't matter if you were kind or clever or careful. The snow fell hard, the wind cut deep, and the wolves, both beast and man, took what they wanted. Out here, survival belonged to the strong. The rest simply disappeared. Leora Vance had learned that lesson the hard way. She stood now at the edge of her small cabin, wrapped in a threadbare cloak that did little against the bite of winter. The sky was bruised purple and gray, heavy with the promise of another storm. Her breath misted in the air as she scanned the tree line, looking for signs of movement. The forest was quiet tonight. Too quiet. That was never a good sign. She turned back toward the cabin, her boots crunching through the frozen crust of yesterday's snow. Her hands were numb despite the wool gloves, and her fingers ached from hours spent gathering firewood. She'd managed to stack enough to last through the coming storm. Barely. Everything out here was barely. Barely enough food. Barely enough warmth. Barely enough will to keep going. But she kept going anyway. Because that was what you did when the world decided you weren't worth keeping. Leora pushed open the cabin door and stepped inside, grateful for the small warmth radiating from the stone hearth. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the rough wooden walls. It wasn't much. A single room with a bed in one corner, a table and 2 chairs, shelves lined with jars of dried herbs and salves, but it was hers. No one could take that from her. She shrugged off her cloak and hung it on a peg by the door, then moved to the hearth to warm her hands. The heat stung her frozen skin, but she welcomed the pain. It meant she was still alive. Still here, still fighting. The memory came unbidden, as it always did. The rejection. She closed her eyes, but that only made it worse. She could still see the crowd, hundreds of them, gathered in the center of Ashenvale for the mating ceremony. She could still feel the weight of their stares, the whispers that followed her wherever she walked, and she could still hear his voice. Darius Kane, alpha of the Ashenvale pack, tall, broad-shouldered, golden-haired. Every inch the leader his people deserved. He'd stood on the platform in the town square, his hand raised for silence, his expression carved from stone. And then he'd spoken the words that destroyed her. I, Darius Kane, alpha of Ashenvale, reject Leora Vance as my mate. The bond, fragile, new, barely formed, had snapped like a thread pulled too tight. The pain had driven her to her knees. She remembered gasping for air, her hands clutching at her chest as if she could hold the pieces of herself together. But there was nothing to hold. The bond was gone, and with it, her place in the pack. Darius hadn't even looked at her. She is weak, he'd said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. Unworthy of standing beside an alpha. The pack deserves better. I cannot bind myself to someone who possesses neither strength nor status. The role of Luna requires power, and she has none. The crowd had murmured in agreement. Some had even nodded, as if his assessment was not only fair, but obvious. Leora had wanted to scream, to tell them they were wrong, that she was more than they saw. But the pain of the severed bond had stolen her voice, her strength, everything. Furthermore, Darius had continued, his tone clinical, detached, her healing abilities, while useful, do not compensate for her lack of dominance. An alpha's mate must command respect. She inspires only pity. Pity. The word had cut deeper than any blade. Someone in the crowd had laughed. A short, sharp sound quickly stifled. But others had joined in, tentative at first, then bolder. The laughter had spread like fire, filling the square until it felt like the entire world was mocking her. Leora had forced herself to stand, even though her legs shook and her vision blurred with tears. She'd looked at Darius one last time, searching his face for any hint of regret, any sign that this was difficult for him. There was nothing. He'd already turned away. Escort her to the border, he'd told his guards. She is no longer pack. No one had argued. No one had spoken in her defense. They just watched as she was led through the crowd, their faces a mix of curiosity and disdain. Some had whispered to each other, their words barely audible but still cutting. Always knew she was too soft. Can't believe the bond even formed in the first place. Poor Darius. Imagine being stuck with someone like that. Leora had kept her head high as long as she could. But once they reached the forest, once the guards had left her at the boundary stones with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small pack of supplies, she'd collapsed. The tears had come then. Great wrenching sobs that tore through her chest and left her gasping for air. She'd cried until there was nothing left, until her throat was raw and her eyes burned. And then she'd stood up. Because what else was there to do? She'd walked north, away from Ashenvale, away from everything she'd ever known. She'd walked until her feet bled and her body screamed for rest. And when she'd finally found this place, a small, abandoned cabin at the edge of the wilderness, she'd claimed it. It had taken weeks to make it livable. The roof had been half collapsed, the windows broken, the floor rotted through in places. But Leora had fixed it. Piece by piece, board by board, she'd rebuilt it with her own 2 hands. And in the process, she'd rebuilt herself. Leora opened her eyes and stared into the fire. That had been 3 years ago. 3 years of surviving alone. 3 years of building a life from scraps and stubbornness. 3 years of proving, to no one but herself, that she was more than what Darius Kane had said she was. She wasn't weak. She was a healer. A damn good one. And out here on the frontier where the nearest pack healer was 2 days' travel through dangerous territory, people needed her. They didn't trust her. Not completely. She was still the rejected Omega, the woman no Alpha had wanted. But when their children fell sick, or their wounds festered, or their fevers burned too high, they came to her door. And she helped them. Every single time. Not because she wanted their approval, not because she thought it would change their minds about her, but because helping people was who she was. It was the one thing Darius and his pack couldn't take from her. The first time someone from the frontier settlements had shown up at her door, she'd been wary. It was an older woman, her face lined with worry, carrying a small child in her arms. "Please," the woman had said, "my grandson. He's burning up. The fever won't break." Leora had hesitated for only a moment before stepping aside and letting them in. She'd spent the entire night working, using every herb and remedy she knew. The child had been close to death, pneumonia, complicated by infection. But by dawn, the fever had broken. The boy had opened his eyes and asked for water. The woman had wept with relief. "Thank you," she'd whispered, pressing a small bundle of dried fish into Leora's hands. "Thank you." Word had spread after that, slowly at first, then faster. The healer in the woods, the one who asked for nothing and turned no one away. They still whispered about her, still called her the rejected one when they thought she couldn't hear, but they came to her nonetheless. And Leora helped them, because that was all she could do. A sudden gust of wind rattled the shutters, pulling her from her thoughts. The storm was moving in faster than she'd expected. She moved to the window and peered out into the growing darkness. The trees bent and swayed, their branches groaning under the weight of ice. Snow had begun to fall again, thick and heavy, blanketing the world in white. She should go to bed, get what rest she could before the storm hit in full. But something stopped her. A feeling. A prickling at the back of her neck, like the sensation of being watched. Leora frowned and pressed her face closer to the glass, squinting through the swirling snow. At first she saw nothing, just the endless stretch of white and shadow. But then, at the very edge of the clearing, something moved. A shape. Large. Dark against the snow. Her breath caught. It moved again, staggering, unsteady, and then it collapsed. Leora's heart hammered in her chest. Every instinct screamed at her to stay inside, to lock the door, and let the storm take whatever was out there. Nothing good came from the woods at night. Nothing human, anyway. The frontier was full of dangers. Rogue wolves who'd been exiled from their packs and turned feral. Bears, massive and territorial. Mountain cats with claws like knives. And worse things, things people only whispered about in the safety of daylight. But her hands were already reaching for her cloak. Damn it. She grabbed a lantern from the table and lit it with shaking fingers, then threw open the door and stepped out into the storm. The wind hit her like a fist, nearly knocking her off her feet. Snow stung her face, and the cold wrapped around her like a vice. She raised the lantern high and moved toward the tree line. "Hello?" she called, her voice swallowed by the wind. Is someone there? No answer. She kept walking, her boots sinking deep into the fresh snow. The shape was closer now, maybe 20 feet away. She could see it more clearly. Not a person. A wolf. Massive. Easily twice the size of any wolf she'd ever seen. Its fur was white, almost luminous in the darkness, and it lay sprawled on its side, unmoving. Steam rose from its body, and the snow around it was stained dark. Blood. Leora stopped, her breath coming fast. This was a bad idea, a terrible idea. Wolves were dangerous, especially ones this size, and injured animals were the most dangerous of all. She'd seen what happened when people tried to help wild creatures. A farmer 2 settlements over had tried to nurse a wounded bear cub back to health. The mother had come looking for it and torn the man apart. They'd found pieces of him scattered across half a mile of forest. This wolf was bigger than any bear. But even as the thought crossed her mind, she was moving forward. She couldn't explain it, couldn't rationalize it. But something deep inside her, something beyond logic or self-preservation, was pulling her toward the creature. She knelt beside the wolf, setting the lantern down in the snow. Up close, it was even more enormous. Its head alone was the size of her torso. Its eyes were closed, its breathing shallow and labored. Deep gashes ran along its side, the wounds ragged and still bleeding, claw marks. Whatever had done this had been trying to kill. "Gods," she whispered. She reached out slowly, her hand hovering just above the wolf's fur. It didn't move, didn't react. She touched it. The fur was soft, impossibly warm despite the cold, and beneath it, she could feel the faint, irregular beat of its heart. It was dying. Leora sat back on her heels, her mind racing. She should leave it, walk away. This wasn't her problem. She had no obligation to save a wild animal that could tear her apart the moment it woke. But she couldn't. She just couldn't. It was the same instinct that made her open her door to sick children and injured travelers. The same instinct that had driven her to become a healer in the first place, despite the fact that her pack had seen it as a weakness rather than a gift. She couldn't watch something die when she had the power to save it, even if that something could kill her. Damn it. "All right," she murmured, more to herself than the wolf. "All right, let's get you inside." It took every ounce of strength she had to drag the wolf back to the cabin. She looped her arms under its massive shoulders and pulled, her boots slipping in the snow, her muscles screaming in protest. The wolf was dead weight, and more than once she nearly gave up. Her lungs burned, her arms trembled, sweat soaked through her clothes despite the freezing temperature. But she didn't stop. Inch by inch, she hauled it across the clearing. She had to stop every few feet to catch her breath, her vision swimming with exhaustion. The wind howled around her, driving snow into her face, making it almost impossible to see. But she kept going. When she finally reached the cabin door, she was gasping for breath, her entire body shaking. She propped the door open with her foot and pulled the wolf inside, dragging it across the threshold and onto the rough wooden floor. By the time she got it fully inside, she was done. She collapsed beside the wolf, her chest heaving, her muscles turned to water. For a long moment, she just lay there, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she'd lost her mind. Probably. But it was too late now. She forced herself to her feet, every movement an agony, and stumbled to the shelves where she kept her supplies. There was no time to rest. If she was going to save this creature, she had to move fast. Leora grabbed her satchel of supplies and knelt beside the wolf again. The wounds were worse than she'd thought, deep, jagged, infected. Whatever had done this had meant to kill. The claw marks were too deliberate, too vicious. This hadn't been a territorial dispute or a fight over prey. This had been an execution attempt. She worked quickly, cleaning the wounds with water and antiseptic, her hands steady despite the fear gnawing at her gut. The wolf didn't wake, didn't even flinch. That was both a blessing and a curse. It meant she could work without being mauled, but it also meant the wolf was far closer to death than she'd hoped. The wounds went deep. She could see muscle and bone in places, the flesh torn open like paper. Infection had already set in. She could smell it, see the angry red edges of the wounds. She packed them with crushed yarrow and comfrey, herbs that would fight infection and promote healing. Then she added a poultice of calendula and honey, sealing it with strips of clean linen. Her hands moved on instinct, guided by years of practice and training. But even as she worked, she knew it wouldn't be enough. The wolf had lost too much blood. Its breathing was too shallow, its heartbeat too weak and irregular. It was going to die. Unless. Lyora hesitated, her hands stilling. There was one thing she could try, one last option, but it was forbidden. Healers weren't supposed to use their own life force to heal others. It was dangerous, draining, sometimes fatal. The elders had warned her when she was still an apprentice, back when she'd been young and eager and thought she could save everyone. "Your power is a gift, Lyora," old Margaret had told her, her weathered face grave. "But it is not limitless. Every time you heal someone, you give a piece of yourself. Small pieces for small wounds, those you can afford. But if you try to pull someone back from the brink of death, if you give too much, it will consume you. And once it starts, you cannot stop it. The healing will take and take until there is nothing left." She'd never done it before. She'd been tempted many times. There had been patients who'd been beyond her skill, people she'd desperately wanted to save, but she'd always held back, remembering Margaret's warning. Until now. Lyora looked down at the wolf, its massive chest barely rising and falling. Why was she even considering this? It was just an animal, a wild creature that owed her nothing and would likely kill her the moment it had the strength. But as she stared at it, she realized something. This wolf had come to her. It could have died anywhere in the endless expanse of the northern forest. But somehow, it had made its way to her clearing, to her door, as if it had known she would help. Ridiculous. But the thought wouldn't leave her. Lyora took a deep breath and placed her hands on the wolf's chest, directly over its heart. She closed her eyes and reached deep inside herself, finding the thread of power that lived at her core. It was warm, steady, humming with energy. Her healing gift. She'd had it for as long as she could remember. Even as a child, she'd been able to sense injuries, feel the wrongness in a body, and know instinctively how to fix it. Her mother had been a healer too, and she'd trained Lyora from the time she could walk. "This is who you are," her mother had told her. "Not your strength or your status. This gift, this is what makes you valuable." Darius hadn't seen it that way, but that didn't matter now. Lyora pulled. The effect was immediate. Heat flooded through her, rushing from her chest down her arms and into the wolf. She felt the connection snap into place, her life force flowing into the creature, knitting torn flesh, mending broken vessels, pulling it back from the edge of death. She could feel every injury as if it were her own, the deep gashes in its side, the cracked ribs, the internal bleeding. She poured her energy into each wound, watching in her mind's eye as tissue knit back together, as bones fused, as blood vessels sealed. But the cost was brutal. Her vision blurred. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She could feel her own strength draining away, pouring into the wolf like water through a sieve. Too much. "You're giving too much." She tried to pull back, but the connection held. The wolf's heart was beating stronger now, its breathing evening out. The wounds were closing, the infection receding. Just a little more, just... Her hands began to shake. Cold spread through her limbs, a deep, bone-chilling cold that had nothing to do with the winter storm outside. Her heartbeat slowed, struggling to keep pace with the energy she was expending. "Stop. You have to stop." But she couldn't. The healing had taken on a life of its own, pulling from her without permission. She was dimly aware of tears streaming down her face, of her body swaying, of the room tilting sideways. The wolf's eyes snapped open. Golden. Burning like molten metal. They fixed on her, and in that instant, Lyora felt something shift. The connection between them deepened, widened, became something more than just the transfer of energy. Power flooded back into her, not her own, but his. Foreign, massive, overwhelming. And then everything went black. Lyora woke to pain. It radiated through her entire body, sharp and relentless, as if every nerve had been scraped raw. She groaned and tried to sit up, but her muscles wouldn't obey. She felt hollow, weak, like something vital had been carved out of her and left a gaping wound behind. Slowly, her vision cleared. She was lying on the floor of her cabin, curled on her side near the hearth. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting the room in dim red light. The storm still raged outside, rattling the shutters with each gust of wind. And beside her, the wolf was gone. Lyora's heart lurched. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, ignoring the wave of dizziness that followed, and looked around the small space. Empty. The bandages she'd wrapped around the wolf lay in a heap on the floor, stained with blood, but intact. The door was still closed, the windows shuttered. There was no sign of how it had left, or even if it had survived. Had it all been a dream? Some fever-induced hallucination brought on by exhaustion and loneliness? No, she could still feel the phantom echo of that connection, the sensation of her life force pouring into another being. And her body bore the evidence. She was weak, drained, barely able to move. She'd saved it. She knew she had. She'd felt its heartbeat strong beneath her hands, felt the wounds close and the life return to its body. But now it was gone. Leora forced herself to her feet, swaying dangerously. Every step was an effort. She stumbled to the door and pulled it open, squinting against the driving snow. Nothing. Just the endless white expanse of the clearing, the dark line of trees beyond. No tracks. No sign that anything had been there at all. The wolf was gone. And she was alone again. The story of her life. Leora closed the door and leaned against it, her chest tight with something she couldn't name. Disappointment? Anger? She wasn't sure. What had she expected? A thank you? It was an animal, a wild, dangerous animal. Of course it had run the moment it was able. She turned back toward the cabin and froze. There, on the small table, sitting in a neat pile, were 3 gold coins. Her breath caught in her throat. She crossed the room slowly, her eyes fixed on the coins. They gleamed in the dim light of the dying fire, heavy and real and impossible. Gold coins didn't just appear. She reached out with the trembling hand and picked one up. It was warm, as if someone had just been holding it. On one side was stamped the image of a wolf's head, crowned and regal. On the other, a symbol she didn't recognize, angular, sharp, like lightning frozen in metal. This was royal currency. From the capital. Leora's mind raced. Who? And then she felt it. A burning sensation on her left shoulder, sudden and sharp. She gasped and reached up, pressing her hand to the spot through her shirt. The pain intensified, searing through her skin like a brand pressed directly to flesh. She stumbled to the small mirror hanging on the wall and yanked down the shoulder of her shirt, twisting to look. A mark. Black as ink, intricate as lace, burned into her skin. It was a wolf's head, just like the one on the coins, surrounded by angular symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the firelight. And above it, unmistakable, was a crown. Leora stared at it, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. This wasn't possible. Marks like this didn't just appear. They were bond marks, symbols of a mating tie between 2 wolves. They formed when a bond was accepted, when 2 souls recognized each other and chose to intertwine. But she wasn't mated, she'd been rejected. The bond with Darius had been severed 3 years ago. She had no mate, no pack, no tie to anyone. And yet, the mark pulsed beneath her fingers, warm and alive and undeniable, as if somewhere on the other side of it, someone was watching. Someone was feeling her. Leora's knees buckled. She caught herself on the edge of the table, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. This couldn't be happening. The wolf. The white wolf she'd saved. It hadn't been just an animal, it had been a shifter, a werewolf. And not just any shifter, the coins, the mark, the sheer size and power she'd felt. Oh gods. She pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to stifle the sound that wanted to escape. A laugh? A sob? She didn't know. The wolf she'd dragged half dead from the snow had marked her, had claimed her, and then disappeared without a word. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Leora's life. She tried to go back to her normal routine, gathering herbs, treating the occasional villager who braved the journey to her cabin, keeping the fire burning through the endless winter nights. But everything felt different now. The mark never faded. If anything, it grew more vivid. The black lines seemed to deepen, the crown above the wolf's head gleaming as if inked with something more than mere pigment. It sat on her shoulder like a secret, hidden beneath her clothes but always present. She couldn't forget it was there, and she couldn't stop thinking about what it meant. She'd researched everything she could remember about mating bonds, pulling out the old texts her mother had left her, reading by candlelight until her eyes burned. Bonds were sacred. They formed when two wolves recognized each other as true mates, soulmates, destined pairs. The connection ran deeper than blood, deeper than pack ties. It was a merging of souls, a link that could never be truly broken. When a bond formed, both wolves received a mark. The symbols were unique to each pair, a physical manifestation of their connection. But bonds required acceptance. Both parties had to agree. One wolf couldn't simply claim another without consent. And yet, she'd been marked, while unconscious, while pouring her life force into a dying creature she'd never met. Had she somehow agreed without realizing it? Or had the wolf taken the choice from her? Leora didn't know. And she couldn't ask, because the wolf was gone. But sometimes, late at night when the cabin was dark and the wind howled outside, she felt something else. Emotions that weren't hers. The first time it happened, she'd been half asleep, drifting in that hazy space between waking and dreaming. Suddenly, a wave of rage had crashed over her, so intense, so all-consuming that she jolted upright in bed, her heart racing. But the cabin was empty, silent. The rage wasn't hers, it was coming from the mark. After that, it happened more frequently. Exhaustion so deep it felt like drowning. Determination like iron. Brief flashes of pain that made her gasp and clutch her shoulder. He was alive. Whoever, whatever, had marked her was alive and feeling these things. And somehow, across whatever distance separated them, she could feel them too. It should have terrified her. Instead, she found it oddly comforting. She wasn't alone. Not really. Somewhere out there, someone was connected to her, bound to her, even if she didn't know who they were. Winter began to loosen its grip on the frontier. The storms came less frequently, the days grew fractionally longer. Leora watched the snow melt in patches, revealing the brown earth beneath. And then, 3 months after the night of the storm, a traveling merchant arrived at her door. His name was Corwin, and she'd traded with him before. He was an older man, grizzled and road-weary, with a pack full of furs and dried meat, and occasionally precious supplies from the southern territories. "Got some willow bark for you," he said, hefting his pack onto her table. "And feverfew. Figured you could use it." "Thank you," Leora said, examining the herbs. They were good quality, fresh, properly dried. "What do I owe you?" Corwin waved a hand. "The salve you gave me last time fixed my joints right up. Call it even." Leora smiled despite herself. Corwin was one of the few people who treated her like a person rather than a cautionary tale. As she prepared tea, he settled into one of her chairs with a groan. "Getting too old for these northern routes," he muttered. "But someone's got to do it." "Any news from the south?" Leora asked, more out of politeness than genuine interest. News from the capital rarely affected life on the frontier. "Big doings," Corwin said, accepting the tea gratefully. "The war's over." That got her attention. She looked up sharply. "War?" Corwin nodded, sipping his tea. "Been going on for months. Surprised you hadn't heard, but I suppose news travels slow out here." "What war?" Leora asked, setting down her own cup. "Civil war," Corwin said grimly. "Some of the southern packs tried to overthrow the throne. 3 of the major alphas, Kane, Voss, and Merrick, formed a coalition. Said the king was too young, too weak, that he'd inherited the throne but not the strength to hold it." Leora's chest tightened. The mark on her shoulder tingled. "What happened?" "They nearly succeeded," Corwin continued. "Took half the kingdom before the king rallied his forces. They say it was brutal, packs turning on each other, entire territories burned. But in the end, the king won." "How?" Corwin leaned back, his eyes distant. "They say he fought like a demon, led every major battle himself, killed dozens with his own hands, alphas, warriors, anyone who stood against him. By the time it was over, the coalition was destroyed. Kane's pack is scattered. Voss is dead. Merrick surrendered and bent the knee." Leora's hands trembled. She clasped them together to hide it. "The king," she said quietly. "What's his name?" Corwin gave her a strange look. "Kyle Draven. You know him?" The mark on her shoulder burned. Leora shook her head slowly. "No, I don't." But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. Because the rage she'd felt in the middle of the night, the exhaustion, the pain, the iron determination, hadn't been random. It had been his. Kyle Draven, the Alpha King, the White Wolf. Her mate. They say he's back in the capital now, Corwin went on, oblivious to the way Leora's world was tilting. Recovering from his wounds, the coronation, well, re-coronation, I suppose, is set for next month. Biggest celebration the kingdom's seen in decades. Leora forced herself to breathe. I see. Corwin studied her for a moment, then shrugged and drained his tea. Anyway, that's the news. Thought you might want to know, seeing as it affects us all. New king means new laws, new taxes, new everything. He stood, shouldering his pack again. You take care of yourself, Leora, he said kindly. Winter's not done with us yet. You too, Corwin. She watched him leave, her mind spinning. Kyle Draven, the Alpha King. For 3 months, she'd been bound to him without knowing it, feeling his emotions, carrying his mark, connected to him in ways she didn't understand. And he hadn't come for her. He'd left her here, alone, with no explanation and no word. Leora sank into her chair, pressing her hand to the mark on her shoulder. Had he even known what he'd done? Or had marking her been an accident, an instinctive reaction to her saving his life, a bond formed in desperation that he'd never wanted? Maybe that was why he'd left gold instead of staying, payment for her services, a way to absolve himself of any debt. Maybe he didn't want a mate, especially not one who'd been publicly rejected by another alpha, one who lived in exile at the edge of nowhere. The thought hurt more than she wanted to admit. Leora stood abruptly and moved to the window, staring out at the melting snow. It didn't matter. He was a king. She was a nobody. Whatever bond existed between them, he clearly had no intention of acknowledging it. And she'd survived worse than being unwanted. She'd survived this too. But late that night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the mark pulsed warm against her skin. And for just a moment, she could have sworn she felt something. Not rage or exhaustion, but longing. Deep, aching longing that made her chest tighten and her eyes sting. She pressed her hand to the mark and closed her eyes. Who are you? No answer came. Just the wind outside and the steady beat of her own heart. And somewhere, impossibly far away, the echo of another heart beating in time with hers. Spring came slowly to the northern frontier, reluctant and uncertain. The snow receded inch by grudging inch, revealing muddy earth and the skeletal remains of winter-killed plants. Leora watched the transformation from her cabin window, her hand absently touching the mark on her shoulder. It had become a habit she couldn't break. The bond, if that's what it was, had grown stronger. The emotions that bled through were no longer faint echoes but vivid intrusions into her daily life. She'd be gathering herbs and suddenly feel a surge of triumph that wasn't hers. She'd be treating a patient and have to pause as exhaustion dragged at her limbs like iron weights. And at night, the longing came. It wrapped around her heart like fingers, squeezing until she couldn't breathe. She didn't know what he was longing for: home, peace, an end to whatever burden he carried. But she felt it nonetheless, and it kept her awake until dawn. She tried to ignore it, tried to focus on her work, her garden, the small rhythms of survival that had sustained her for 3 years. But the mark wouldn't let her forget. One morning in early spring, she woke to find the mark had changed. The black lines had deepened to an impossibly dark shade, and the crown above the wolf's head now seemed to shimmer with a faint golden light. When she touched it, heat radiated through her entire body. Not painful, but intense, demanding attention. Something had shifted. She stood in front of her mirror, staring at the mark, when the first real pulse of emotion hit her. Not rage or exhaustion. Fear. Raw, visceral fear that made her heart hammer and her breath catch. He was afraid. The Alpha King, the man who'd fought a war and won, who'd killed dozens with his bare hands, was terrified. Leora pressed both hands to the mark, as if she could somehow reach through it and offer comfort. But the fear didn't fade. If anything, it intensified, accompanied by something else. Pain, searing, burning pain that shot through her shoulder and down her arm. She gasped and stumbled backward, catching herself on the edge of her bed. The pain lasted only seconds, but it left her shaking. He was hurt. Again. The thought came unbidden. I should go to him. Ridiculous. She didn't even know where he was. And even if she did, what would she do? Walk up to the capital and demand to see the Alpha King because she felt his emotions through a bond he probably didn't want? They'd laugh her out of the city. Or worse. Leora forced herself to breathe, to calm the panic rising in her chest. This wasn't her problem. Whatever Kyle Draven was dealing with, he had an entire kingdom to help him. He didn't need a rejected Omega from the frontier. He'd made that clear when he'd left without a word. She dressed quickly and stepped outside, hoping fresh air would clear her head. The morning was crisp and bright, the sun finally strong enough to melt the last patches of ice. Birds had returned to the forest, their calls echoing through the trees. It should have been peaceful. Instead, Leora felt like she was standing on the edge of a precipice, waiting to fall. She spent the day in her garden, turning the soil and preparing it for planting. Physical labor helped. It gave her something to focus on besides the constant hum of foreign emotions in the back of her mind. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear the horses until they were nearly at her door. Leora looked up, squinting against the sun, and froze. 5 riders approached through the trees, their horses picking their way carefully through the muddy ground. They wore the colors of Ashenvale, deep green and silver, her former pack. Leora's stomach dropped. She stood slowly, brushing dirt from her hands, and watched them approach. The lead rider was familiar. Marcus, one of Darius's enforcers. He'd been the one to escort her to the border 3 years ago, his face impassive as he'd left her alone in the wilderness. He looked older now, harder. The riders stopped at the edge of her clearing, and Marcus dismounted. The others stayed on their horses, their hands resting casually on their weapons. "Leora Vance," Marcus said, his voice flat. "Marcus." She kept her tone neutral. "What brings Ashenvale to the frontier?" "Official business." He pulled a rolled parchment from his saddlebag and held it out. "You're summoned." Leora didn't move. "Summoned where?" "Ashenvale. Alpha Cain requests your presence." The world tilted. Darius, requesting her presence. After 3 years of silence, of pretending she didn't exist, he was summoning her? "Why?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Marcus's expression didn't change. "That's between you and the Alpha, but the summons is official. You're required to comply." "And if I refuse?" One of the other riders shifted in his saddle, his hand moving to the hilt of his sword. Marcus noticed and raised a hand, stopping him. "Don't make this difficult," Marcus said quietly. "You know how this works." Leora's hands clenched into fists. She did know. A summons from an Alpha wasn't a request. It was a command. Refusing meant being declared rogue, which meant any wolf who found her could kill her without consequence. She was trapped. "When?" she asked through gritted teeth. "Now. We'll wait while you pack." Leora wanted to argue, to demand answers, to tell them all to go to hell. But the riders were armed and she wasn't. And even if she fought, where would she run? The frontier was vast, but not infinite. They'd find her eventually. She turned and walked back into her cabin, her mind racing. Why would Darius summon her now? What could he possibly want after all this time? She threw a few belongings into a pack, spare clothes, her medicine kit, the small amount of money she'd saved. Her hand shook as she worked, anger and fear warring in her chest. The mark on her shoulder pulsed, warm and insistent. She pressed her hand to it, closing her eyes. "I don't know what to do." No answer came. Just the steady thrum of the bond connecting her to someone who wasn't here. Leora shouldered her pack and stepped outside. The riders were waiting, silent and watchful. "Ready?" Marcus asked. "No," she wanted to say. "I'll never be ready to go back to the place that rejected me." But she nodded and walked toward the horses. One of the riders offered her his hand, pulling her up behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling the eyes of the others on her. They rode south without another word. The journey to Ashenvale took 2 days. 2 days of silence broken only by the sounds of horses and wind. The riders didn't speak to her, didn't explain, didn't even acknowledge her presence beyond the basic necessities of travel. Leora spent the time watching the landscape change. The wild frontier gave way to cultivated fields and small settlements. Villages appeared, clusters of houses surrounded by wooden fences. People stopped to watch them pass, their faces curious and wary. She kept her head down, hood pulled low. On the second day, they crested a hill and Ashenvale spread out below them. Leora's breath caught despite herself. It had grown. New buildings lined the main road, and the marketplace had expanded to twice its former size. The pack house, Darius's seat of power, dominated the center of town, its stone walls imposing and solid. She'd been born here, had lived her entire life within these boundaries until the day she was cast out. Coming back felt like stepping into a grave. They rode straight to the pack house, and the gates opened without question. Inside the courtyard, servants moved with quiet efficiency, barely glancing at the riders. But they looked at her. Whispers followed her as Marcus helped her dismount. She heard her name, spoken in hushed tones laced with surprise and speculation. The rejected one. She's back. Why would the Alpha summon her? Leora kept her expression blank and followed Marcus into the building. The interior was exactly as she remembered: polished wood floors, tapestries depicting the pack's history, the smell of pine and smoke. They climbed the main staircase and stopped outside a heavy oak door. Marcus knocked once. "Enter," came the response. That voice. Leora's hands curled into fists. Marcus pushed open the door and gestured for her to go in. She stepped past him into the Alpha's office. Darius Kane sat behind a massive desk, reviewing documents. He didn't look up immediately, and Leora used the moment to study him. He looked the same. Golden hair, strong jaw, broad shoulders. Still handsome in that cold, untouchable way that had once made her heart race. Now she felt nothing. Finally, Darius set down his papers and looked at her. His eyes, pale blue like ice, swept over her with clinical detachment, as if she were a stranger, as if they hadn't once been bonded, however briefly. "Leora," he said, "thank you for coming." "Thank you," as if she'd had a choice. "What do you want, Darius?" His eyebrow raised slightly at her tone. Behind her, Marcus shifted, but Darius waved him away. "Leave us." Marcus hesitated, then bowed and left, closing the door behind him. Silence filled the room. Darius stood and walked around his desk, leaning against it with his arms crossed, studying her. "You look well," he said. "The frontier suits you." Leora said nothing. He sighed. "I suppose you're wondering why I summoned you." The thought had crossed my mind. "There's been talk," Darius said, his tone careful. "Rumors spreading through the packs. About you." Leora's stomach tightened. "What kind of rumors?" "That you bear a mark." His eyes dropped to her shoulder, hidden beneath her cloak. "A royal mark." The world stopped. How did he know? "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice came out too sharp, too defensive. Darius's expression hardened. "Don't lie to me. One of the frontier settlers saw it when you were treating his wife. He recognized the symbols and reported it to his Alpha, who reported it to me." Leora's mind raced. She'd been so careful, always kept it covered. But there had been one time, a difficult birth, a woman bleeding out, no time to worry about modesty. She'd torn off her shirt to use as additional bandages, and the mark had been visible for hours. One witness. That's all it took. "Show me," Darius commanded. "No." His eyes flashed. "That wasn't a request." "I don't care." Leora took a step back. "I don't answer to you anymore. You made sure of that." "You answer to me as long as you're in my territory," Darius snapped. His Alpha presence flooded the room, pressing down on her like a physical weight. "And right now, you're standing in my office. So I'll ask one more time. Show me the mark." Leora's wolf stirred inside her, hackles raised. She'd never been particularly dominant, never had the kind of power that could challenge an Alpha, but she'd also never been bonded to a king before. The mark on her shoulder flared to life, burning hot. Power surged through her, foreign, massive, utterly overwhelming. It rose up like a tidal wave, meeting Darius's Alpha presence and smashing through it like glass. Darius stumbled backward, his eyes wide with shock. Leora stood frozen, her chest heaving. The power receded as quickly as it had come, leaving her shaking. What the hell was that? Darius recovered quickly, but she could see the wariness in his eyes now, the calculation. "So it's true," he said quietly. "You're bonded to him." "I don't know what I am," Leora said, her voice raw. "But it's none of your concern. It's every pack's concern when an unclaimed Omega suddenly bears the mark of the Alpha King." Darius moved back to his desk, putting distance between them. "Do you understand what this means? What kind of questions it raises?" "I didn't ask for this." "That's not how it looks." Darius's tone was cold now, businesslike. It looks like you've been marked by K.L. Draven, which means one of two things. Either you're his mate or you're his mistress. The word hit her like a slap. I'm neither, Leora said through gritted teeth. I saved his life, that's all. You expect me to believe the Alpha King marked you out of gratitude? Darius laughed, sharp and humorless. Marks don't work that way. You know that. I know what I did, and I know he left without a word. That gave Darius pause. He abandoned you? He paid me and left. Silence. Darius studied her, his expression unreadable. Then he sat down, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. This is a problem, Leora. For you, maybe. Not for me. For everyone. He leaned forward. The Harvest Festival is in 3 days. Every pack within 200 miles will be here, including representatives from the capital. If word spreads that you're here, bearing a mark you can't explain, it will cause chaos. Then let me leave. No. The word was final. You're staying, under guard, until we figure out what to do with you. Rage exploded in Leora's chest. You can't keep me here. I can, and I will. Darius stood. You'll be given a room in the guest quarters. You're not to leave the packhouse grounds. If you try, my guards have orders to stop you. This is insane. This is necessary. Darius moved to the door and opened it. Marcus was waiting outside as if he'd never left. Take her to the West Wing. Post guards at her door. You're making me a prisoner, Leora said, her voice shaking with fury. Darius looked at her one last time, and for just a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Regret? Pity? I'm protecting my pack, he said quietly, from whatever storm you're about to bring down on us. The door closed. Marcus gestured for her to follow. Leora had no choice. She walked with him through the corridors, feeling the weight of every stare, every whispered conversation. The room they gave her was comfortable enough. A bed, a window, a small washstand. But when Marcus closed the door, she heard the distinct sound of a lock turning. She was a prisoner. Leora sank onto the bed and pressed both hands to her face. This couldn't be happening. The mark on her shoulder pulsed, and she felt it again, that foreign presence on the other end of the bond. Closer now. More alert. He knew something was wrong. Leora pulled down her sleeve and stared at the mark. The wolf's head seemed to stare back at her, the crown above it glowing faintly in the dim light. Where are you? She whispered. No answer. Just the steady thrum of the bond, connecting her to a man she'd never met. A man who'd marked her and left her to face the consequences alone. 3 days until the Harvest Festival. 3 days to figure out how to escape before Darius decided she was too much of a liability to keep alive. Leora stood and moved to the window. The grounds below were busy with preparations. Banners being hung, stages being built, merchants setting up their stalls. In 3 days, this place would be packed with wolves from every corner of the region, and she would be trapped in the middle of it all, wearing a mark that branded her as either the Alpha King's mate or his whore. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass. The frontier had been harsh, but at least it had been honest. At least she'd been free. Now she was back in the world of politics and power, where her body was currency, and her choices meant nothing. The mark burned against her skin, and for the first time since that snowy night 3 months ago, Leora felt something she'd been trying to deny. Anger. Not at Darius. Not at the pack that had rejected her. At him. At K.L. Draven, the Alpha King, who'd marked her without permission and disappeared without explanation, leaving her to deal with consequences he couldn't be bothered to face. If she ever saw him again, she was going to make him answer for it. Every single question. But first, she had to survive the next 3 days. The hours crawled past like wounded animals. Leora spent them pacing the small room, testing the window, locked, the door, guarded, and her own patience, nearly gone. Servants brought her meals, but they wouldn't meet her eyes and answered none of her questions. She was alone. On the second day, the mark changed again. Leora woke to find new symbols had appeared around the wolf's head, intricate knotwork that seemed to pulse with a faint silver light. When she traced them with her fingers, she felt a jolt of energy run through her entire body. The bond was deepening. She didn't understand how or why, but she could feel it, like roots growing deeper into soil, impossible to extract without destroying everything. And with the deepening came clearer emotions. She felt his frustration, his impatience, his growing awareness that something was wrong. He was looking for her. The thought should have comforted her. Instead, it terrified her. Because if he came looking and found her here, locked in Darius's pack house, it would mean war. Alphas didn't tolerate other alphas holding their mates prisoner, even if the mate in question had never been formally claimed. And Kael Draven had just finished one war. She doubted he'd hesitate to start another. On the evening of the second day, the door opened. Leora looked up, expecting a servant with dinner. Instead, Darius stepped inside. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it, studying her with that same clinical detachment. "You've been difficult," he said.
"You've been an ass," Leora shot back. His lips twitched, almost a smile. "Still sharp-tongued. I'd forgotten that about you. You forgot everything about me the moment you rejected me." The almost smile vanished. "That's not true." "Isn't it?" Leora stood facing him across the small room. "You stood in front of the entire pack and called me weak, unworthy. You said I inspired pity, and then you threw me away like garbage. I did what was necessary. For who? Certainly not for me." Darius was silent for a long moment. Then he moved to the window, staring out at the preparations below. "I was young," he said quietly. "Newly appointed alpha. The pack was watching everything I did, judging every decision. They expected strength, dominance, a mate who could stand beside me and command respect. And I couldn't. You were a healer, Leora, gentle, kind. The pack saw that as weakness. So you agreed with them. I agreed that an alpha needs a certain kind of mate." He turned to look at her. Someone who can fight, who can lead, who can inspire fear when necessary. "And love?" Leora's voice was bitter. "Does that factor into your calculations at all?" "Love is a luxury alphas can't afford." The words hung in the air between them. Leora laughed, sharp and humorless. "You know what's funny? I spent 3 years thinking you were right, thinking I was weak, that I deserved to be rejected. But I'm not weak. I survived alone in the wilderness. I built a life from nothing. I saved the life of the most powerful wolf in the kingdom." She pulled down her sleeve, revealing the mark. "This," she said, her voice shaking with anger, "is proof that I was never the problem. You were." Darius stared at the mark, and for the first time she saw real emotion cross his face. Envy. "You're right," he said softly. "You were never weak. I was just too blind to see it." Leora pulled her sleeve back up. "Why are you here, Darius?" "To warn you." He moved closer, his voice dropping. "The festival starts tomorrow. Representatives from the capital will be here, nobles, council members, maybe even members of the king's guard. If they see that mark, what? They'll tell him I'm here? They'll assume you're an imposter, or worse, that you somehow forced the bond." Darius's expression was grave. "Royal marks are sacred, Leora. Only the king can bestow them. If people think you're wearing one fraudulently, they'll demand proof. And if you can't provide it, what happens? They'll kill you, publicly, as an example." Cold dread settled in Leora's stomach. "So what do you suggest?" she asked. "You won't let me leave, but staying is a death sentence." "There's one option." Darius hesitated. "Renounce the mark." "What?" "Publicly declare that the bond is false, that you were confused or mistaken, or that someone marked you against your will. Reject it." Leora stared at him. "You want me to reject a bond with the Alpha King? I want you to survive." Darius's voice was urgent now. "If you renounce it, publicly and convincingly, the capital's representatives will have no grounds to challenge you. You'll be free to leave, to go back to the frontier and live in peace. And if I don't? Then you'd better pray the king shows up to claim you before someone else decides you're a threat that needs to be eliminated." He moved to the door, then paused. "Think about it, Leora. You have until tomorrow night. After that, the choice will be taken from you." The door closed. The lock turned. Leora sank onto the bed, her mind reeling. Renounce the bond. Reject Kael Draven the same way Darius had rejected her. It would be so easy. Stand up in front of the crowd, say the words, and walk away. Free, safe,
alone. Her hand moved to the mark without conscious thought. Could she do it? Could she sever this connection that she barely understood but had grown so accustomed to? The bond pulsed, warm and alive. And for the first time she felt something new through it, not rage or fear or longing, but recognition. As if somewhere across the distance that separated them, Kyle Draven had finally realized exactly who she was. And he was coming. The mark flared hot, and Leora gasped as power flooded through her, not her own, but his, vast and terrible and absolutely certain. He was coming for her, and nothing was going to stop him. Leora stood and moved to the window, pressing her palm against the glass. Tomorrow night, the Harvest Festival, when the entire region would be gathered in one place. She closed her eyes and felt the bond stretch between them like a silver thread pulled taut. One way or another, everything was about to change. The morning of the Harvest Festival dawned cold and bright, the sky a pale wash of blue that promised nothing but trouble. Leora woke to the sound of voices outside her window, workers shouting instructions, horses neighing, the general chaos of preparation reaching its peak. She lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of what was coming settle over her like a shroud. Today, she would either renounce the bond or face the consequences. Neither option felt like a choice. The mark on her shoulder burned steadily now, no longer pulsing but radiating constant heat. She could feel him through it, closer than before, moving with purpose. The emotions that bled through were sharp and focused, determination, anger, and underneath it all something that felt almost like fear. Not for himself, for her. Leora sat up slowly and moved to the washstand. Her reflection in the small mirror looked haunted, dark circles under her eyes, skin pale, hair tangled from a restless night. She looked like what she was, a woman trapped between two impossible choices, both of which would destroy her in different ways. A knock at the door made her turn. "Enter," she called, expecting another silent servant with breakfast. Instead, a young woman stepped inside, barely 20, with kind eyes and nervous hands. She carried a dress draped over her arm, deep green silk that caught the morning light. "Alpha Kane sent this," the girl said softly, laying the dress on the bed. "For tonight. He said you're to wear it to the festival." Leora stared at the dress. It was beautiful, expensive, the kind of thing she'd never owned even when she'd been part of the pack, the kind of thing a Luna would wear. "Why?" she asked. The girl hesitated. "He didn't say, but—" She glanced toward the door, then lowered her voice. "There are rumors about you, about the mark. I'm sure there are. Some people are saying you forced it, used dark magic or trickery." The girl's eyes were wide. "But others are saying the king marked you willingly, that you're his true mate." Leora laughed bitterly. "And what do you think?" The girl looked at her for a long moment. "I think you're scared, and I think Alpha Kane is making a mistake keeping you here." Before Leora could respond, the girl hurried out, closing the door softly behind her. Leora turned back to the dress. Darius wanted her to look the part tonight, wanted her presentable, dignified, worthy of standing before the gathered packs, so they could watch her renounce a bond she didn't understand, or watch her die for refusing. She dressed mechanically, pulling on the green silk and fastening the delicate clasps. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. When she looked in this mirror again, she barely recognized herself. She looked like someone important, someone worth claiming. The irony wasn't lost on her. Hours crawled past, servants came and went, bringing food she didn't eat, water she didn't drink. Outside, the festival preparations reached a crescendo. Music drifted through the window, along with the smells of roasting meat and fresh bread. As evening approached, the lock on her door turned. Marcus stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "It's time," he said. Leora stood, smoothing the silk of her dress with trembling hands. "Where are we going?" "The main square. Alpha Kane wants you on the platform when he makes his announcement." Her stomach dropped. "What announcement?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "You'll find out with everyone else." He gestured for her to follow. Leora walked past him into the corridor, feeling the weight of his presence behind her. 2 more guards fell into step as they descended the stairs, forming a cage around her. They weren't taking any chances. The pack house opened onto the main square, and the sight that greeted her stole her breath. Hundreds of people filled the space, pack members, visitors from neighboring territories, merchants, children running between the stalls. Banners hung from every building, green and silver for Ashenvale, but also the colors of a dozen other packs. Torches blazed against the gathering dusk, turning the square into a sea of flickering gold, and in the center, a raised platform. Marcus guided her toward it, the crowd parting reluctantly as they passed. She felt every eye on her, heard the whispers start and spread like wildfire. That's her. The rejected one. What's she doing here? Look at her dress. Cain's colors. Leora kept her head high, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. They reached the platform and Marcus helped her up the steps. The wood was solid beneath her feet, but she felt like she was standing on water. Darius was already there, standing at the center of the platform with several other alphas, representatives from the surrounding packs. They all turned to look at her as she appeared, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed contempt. One of them, a barrel-chested man with a thick beard, sneered openly. "This is her?" he said to Darius. "The one causing all the fuss?" "Alpha Gregor," Darius said evenly. "May I present Leora Vance?" "I know who she is." Gregor looked her up and down. "The Omega you rejected 3 years ago. Why is she here wearing your colors?" "That will be explained shortly," Darius said. Before Gregor could respond, a murmur ran through the crowd. Leora turned to see a group of newcomers entering the square. 6 figures in dark cloaks, moving with the kind of fluid grace that marked them as trained warriors. Capital soldiers. The King's Guard. Leora's blood turned to ice. The soldiers made their way to the platform, and the crowd fell silent. One of them, a tall woman with silver hair and scars across her face, climbed the steps and approached Darius. "Alpha Cain," she said, her voice carrying across the sudden quiet. "I am Commander Sylvain of the Royal Guard. We're here on behalf of His Majesty." Darius inclined his head. "Commander, we're honored by your presence." Sylvain's eyes swept the platform, landing on Leora. They narrowed. "We've heard interesting rumors," she said, "about a woman in your territory bearing a royal mark." The square erupted in whispers. Darius raised his hand for silence. "The rumors are true, Commander, but the situation is complicated." "Complicated how?" "The mark appeared without the king's knowledge or consent. The woman in question claims it was the result of healing magic gone awry." Leora's hands clenched. He was already setting up her renunciation, framing it so she'd have no choice but to deny the bond. Sylvain's expression hardened. "Show me." All eyes turned to Leora. She stood frozen, her mind racing. If she showed the mark, there would be no going back. The capital's representatives would demand answers she couldn't give. They might declare her a fraud, or worse, an enemy of the crown. But if she refused, they'd assume she had something to hide. "Well," Sylvain said, her hand moving to the sword at her hip, "show me the mark, now." Leora's fingers moved to her shoulder, trembling. She pulled down the sleeve of her dress, revealing the intricate black and silver design burned into her skin. The crowd gasped. Sylvain stepped closer, her eyes widening. She reached out as if to touch it, then stopped, her hand hovering inches from Leora's skin. "Merciful gods," she whispered, "it's real." "Of course it's real," Gregor said loudly. "The question is how she got it. Royal marks can't be forged, but they can be stolen. Dark magic, blood rituals." "I used no magic," Leora said, her voice cutting through his. "I saved a dying wolf, that's all." "And this wolf just happened to be the Alpha King?" Gregor laughed, the sound ugly. "Do you expect us to believe that?" "I don't care what you believe." "You should." Gregor turned to Darius. "This is your territory, Cain. Your responsibility. If she's lying, if she's used forbidden magic to steal a royal bond, it reflects on you, on all of us." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the other alphas. Darius's expression was tight, which is why we're addressing it tonight, publicly. He stepped forward, his voice carrying across the square. 3 years ago, I rejected Leora Vance as my mate. I sent her to the frontier to live alone because I believed she was too weak to stand beside an alpha. He paused, his eyes finding hers. I was wrong about many things, but I was not wrong to protect my pack from uncertainty. The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. Recently, it came to my attention that Leora bears a royal mark, bonding her to our king. This mark appeared without ceremony, without witness, under circumstances that remain unclear. Darius's tone hardened. Such a bond, if legitimate, would make her future queen, but if illegitimate, it makes her a threat to the entire kingdom. Leora's nails dug into her palms. Therefore, Darius continued, I have brought her here tonight to make a choice. Before these witnesses, before the representatives of the crown, she will either prove the bond is genuine or renounce it. The square erupted. Shouts and arguments broke out across the crowd. Some demanded proof, others called for her immediate execution. A very few, called for mercy. Sylvain raised her hand, and silence fell again. The king is the only one who can verify a royal bond, she said. Unless he comes forward to claim her, we have no way to know if this mark is real or fabricated. Then let her renounce it, Gregor said, publicly. If she refuses, we know she's lying.
And if she agrees? Leora asked, her voice shaking with barely controlled rage. What then? You'll just let me walk away? If you renounce the bond convincingly, you'll be free to leave, Darius said. You have my word. Your word means nothing to me. The crowd gasped at her audacity. An Omega speaking that way to an Alpha was unthinkable. But Leora was done being quiet. You want me to stand here and deny a bond I didn't ask for, with a man I've never met, because it's inconvenient for you. Her voice rose, carrying across the square. You want me to make your lives easier, the same way you've been trying to make them easier since the day you threw me away. Leora, Darius started. No. She stepped forward, and several of the guards reached for their weapons. I'm done. Done being treated like I'm disposable. Done being told I'm too weak, too soft, too worthless to matter. The mark on her shoulder flared, burning hot. Power surged through her, that same foreign, overwhelming force she'd felt in Darius's office, but stronger now, infinitely stronger. The platform beneath her feet cracked. Sylvain drew her sword. Stand down! I can't, Leora gasped. The power was pouring through her, unstoppable, and she didn't know how to control it. I'm not doing this. And then she felt it. A presence, massive and furious and moving fast. The bond snapped taut, and through it came a single emotion so powerful it drove her to her knees. Rage. Not hers. His. The crowd screamed. Leora looked up, following their terrified gazes to the sky. A massive white wolf was descending from the rooftops, leaping from building to building with impossible speed and grace. It was enormous, larger than any wolf had a right to be, its fur gleaming silver in the torchlight, its eyes burning gold. The same wolf she'd saved, the Alpha King. He hit the platform with enough force to shatter half the boards, sending guards and Alphas scrambling backward. Several fell off the edge entirely. The crowd surged away from the platform, screaming and shouting. The white wolf landed between Leora and Sylvain, his lips pulled back in a snarl that showed teeth like daggers. Stand down! Sylvain shouted again, but her voice shook. The wolf ignored her. He turned his massive head toward Leora, those golden eyes locking onto hers. Recognition crashed through the bond. You. And then he shifted. The transformation was violent and swift. Bones cracked and reformed, fur receding to reveal skin, limbs lengthening and reshaping. In seconds, a man stood where the wolf had been. Kyle Draven. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with silver white hair that fell to his shoulders and the same burning gold eyes. His face was all sharp angles and brutal beauty, marked with scars that spoke of battles won and wars survived. He wore dark leather and metal, fitted like armor, and he radiated power that made every wolf in the square drop their eyes. Every wolf except Leora. She stared at him, unable to look away. This was the man who'd marked her, the king she'd saved without knowing his identity. And he was furious. Someone, Kyle said, his voice low and deadly, want to explain why my mate is standing on a platform surrounded by armed guards. The square fell silent. Darius stepped forward carefully, his hands raised. Your Majesty, we didn't know what? Kale's eyes never left Leora. That she was mine? The mark should have made that clear. We had no confirmation, No word from the capital. You thought you could force her to renounce me. Kale's voice dropped even lower, and the air around him seemed to crackle. In my kingdom, while I still draw breath. Your Majesty, please. Kale moved so fast Leora barely saw it. One moment he was standing still. The next he had Darius by the throat, lifting him off his feet. You rejected her once, Kale said, his voice deadly calm. Cast her out. Left her to survive alone in the wilderness.
And now you dare to imprison her? To threaten her? Darius clawed at Kael's hand, his face turning purple. Kael. Leora's voice cut through the tension. Put him down! Kael's eyes snapped to her. For a moment she thought he'd refuse. Then he opened his hand, and Darius dropped to the platform, gasping. Kael turned to face the crowd, and his voice carried across the square with the weight of absolute authority. Let me make something very clear, he said. This woman is my mate. She is marked by my hand and bonded to my soul. Anyone who threatens her threatens me. Anyone who harms her will answer to me personally. He looked at each alpha in turn, and they all dropped their eyes. She is under my protection, now and forever. Then he turned back to Leora and held out his hand. Come here. It wasn't a request. Leora's legs moved without conscious thought. She crossed the broken platform and took his hand. The moment their skin touched, the bond exploded. Power flooded through her, his power, vast and terrible and absolutely certain. But it wasn't forcing itself on her, it was offering itself, asking permission. She felt his emotions with perfect clarity now. The rage was still there, but underneath it was relief so profound it made her chest ache. He'd been searching for her, for months, ever since the night he'd woken in her cabin and realized what he'd done. He'd felt her fear through the bond and come running. Are you hurt? He asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Leora shook her head, unable to speak. Kyle's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. The gesture was gentle, at odds with the violence still thrumming through him. I'm sorry, he said. I should have come sooner, should have found you before. It's not your fault. It is. His eyes searched hers. I left you alone, let you face this without me. You didn't know where I was. I should have looked harder. Before Leora could respond, Sylvain cleared her throat. Your Majesty, she said carefully, perhaps this conversation would be better held in private? Kael didn't look at her. No. What I have to say needs to be heard by everyone. He turned, pulling Leora with him until they faced the crowd together, his arm wrapped around her waist, holding her against his side with unmistakable possession. 3 months ago, I was ambushed during the war, Kael said, his voice carrying across the silent square, left for dead in the northern frontier. I would have died if not for this woman. She found me, dragged me into her home, and healed me at great personal cost. He paused, and Leora felt his hand tighten on her waist. I marked her while dying, claimed her before I even knew her name. It was instinct, my wolf recognizing its mate and refusing to let go. His voice softened. When I woke, she was unconscious, nearly dead from the energy she'd given me. I left gold to cover the debt and returned to the war thinking I could come back for her when it was over. Kael's expression hardened again. But the war took longer than expected, and by the time I was free to search for her, the trail had gone cold. I've been looking for 3 months, following rumors and half-remembered descriptions, and I find her here, in chains. Darius had recovered enough to stand. Your Majesty, I was only trying to protect... You were trying to control her, Kael said flatly. Just like you tried 3 years ago when you rejected her. Tell me, Alpha Cain, do you regret that decision? Darius's jaw worked. I did what I thought was right. That's not what I asked. Silence stretched. Finally, Darius spoke. Yes, I regret it. Good. Kael's smile was sharp. Because the woman you threw away is about to become queen of this entire realm, and you'll spend the rest of your life knowing you had her and were too blind to see what she was worth. The crowd erupted again, but this time with a different energy. Shock. Awe. Some cheered. Others stood in stunned silence. Kael ignored them all. He turned to Leora, and when he spoke, his voice was for her alone. I know this isn't how it should have happened. I know you deserve better. A choice, time, courtship. but I can't undo the mark, and I won't pretend I want to." His eyes searched hers. "I'm asking you now, with witnesses of your own free will. Will you accept this bond? Will you stand beside me?" Leora's heart hammered. Every eye in the square was on her, waiting for her answer. This was the moment Darius had tried to force, the public declaration. But this time it was her choice. She looked at Kael, this man she'd saved, this stranger who'd marked her, this king who'd torn across the kingdom to find her. She felt the bond between them, warm and alive and waiting, and she knew her answer. Yes. The single word fell into silence. Then Kael smiled, a real smile, fierce and bright, and pulled her into his arms. The kiss was inevitable. His mouth claimed hers with the same certainty as the mark, possessive and demanding and absolutely right. Power surged through the bond, sealing it, completing it, making it unbreakable. When they finally broke apart, the mark on Leora's shoulder was glowing, brilliant silver light that made the crowd gasp. Kael's shoulder bore an identical mark now, visible through the tear in his shirt. The bond was complete, mutual, unbreakable. Kael turned to the crowd, still holding Leora against him. "Spread the word," he said. "In 1 month, there will be a coronation, and the kingdom will have its queen." The crowd erupted in cheers, not all of them, but enough. Sylvain stepped forward and knelt. "Your Majesty, Your Majesty." She addressed them both. One by one, the guards followed. Then some of the alphas, then members of the crowd. Kneeling, acknowledging, accepting. Leora stared at the sea of bowed heads, her mind reeling. An hour ago, she'd been a prisoner facing execution or exile. Now she was standing beside a king, wearing his mark, about to become queen. It didn't feel real. Kael's hand found hers and squeezed. "Breathe," he murmured. She did, and the world came back into focus. Darius still stood on the platform watching them. His expression was carefully blank, but she saw the defeat in his eyes. He'd lost. Not just her, but the power play he'd been trying to make. Kael had come and claimed her in front of everyone, and there was nothing Darius could do about it. "We're leaving," Kael said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Tonight, anyone who has business with me can address it through official channels." He stepped off the platform, lifting Leora down beside him. The crowd parted, creating a path. They walked through the square together, her hand in his, the bond singing between them. Behind them, Leora heard Darius's voice, low and bitter. "What have I done?" She didn't look back. For the first time in 3 years, she was moving forward, and this time she wasn't alone. Kael's camp lay 3 miles outside Ashenvale, hidden in a dense grove of pines that offered both cover and strategic advantage. Leora counted at least 50 soldiers as they approached, all of them armed and watchful, their eyes tracking her every movement with the kind of scrutiny reserved for potential threats. She was the woman their king had claimed, the future queen, and they had no idea what to make of her. Neither did she. Kael led her through the camp without speaking, his hand still wrapped around hers. Soldiers stepped aside as they passed, some bowing, others simply staring. A few whispered to each other, their voices too low for her to catch the words, but their tone clear enough. Skepticism, doubt, curiosity. She couldn't blame them. They stopped in front of a large tent, clearly Kael's, judging by the royal crest emblazoned on the canvas. He pushed aside the entrance flap and gestured for her to enter. Inside, the tent was surprisingly spacious. A campaign desk dominated one side, covered in maps and correspondence. A bedroll lay in the corner, military simple. A trunk sat at the foot of it, presumably containing his personal effects. Everything was efficient, practical, designed for a man who lived at war. Kael let the flap fall closed behind them, and suddenly they were alone. The silence stretched, heavy with everything unsaid. Leora turned to face him, and for the first time since the platform, she really looked at him, studied him. The scars that crossed his jaw and disappeared beneath his collar. The tension in his shoulders despite the victory he'd just claimed. The way his eyes, those burning gold eyes, watched her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "You came," she said finally. "Of course I came." "You didn't have to. You could have let me renounce the bond, let me walk away." Kael's expression hardened. "Is that what you wanted?" I don't know what I wanted. I still don't.
Leora wrapped her arms around herself. 3 months. You marked me 3 months ago and disappeared. Do you have any idea what that was like? I left you gold. I don't want your gold. Her voice rose. I wanted answers. I wanted to know why I was feeling emotions that weren't mine. Why I had a mark I never asked for burning into my skin. Why I was bonded to someone I'd never even met. Kale flinched. You're right. The admission surprised her. She'd expected defensiveness, justification, not this quiet acceptance. I should have stayed, he continued, moving closer, or come back sooner. But I was in the middle of a war and I thought... He stopped, running a hand through his silver hair. I thought I was protecting you by keeping my distance. If my enemies knew about you, they would have used you against me. So instead you left me to deal with the consequences alone. Yes. His eyes met hers. And that was wrong. I'm sorry. Leora stared at him, an alpha, a king, apologizing to her, acknowledging fault without excuse or caveat. It was so far from anything she'd expected that she didn't know how to respond. When I woke in your cabin, Kael said quietly, I knew immediately what I'd done. I could feel the bond, feel you through it, even though you were unconscious. I wanted to stay, to wait until you woke and explain everything. But my soldiers had tracked me to the frontier, and they told me the Southern Pacts had taken 3 more territories. If I didn't return immediately, we'd lose the war. He moved to the desk, bracing his hands against it. So I made a choice. I left gold to ensure you'd be cared for, and I went back to finish what I'd started. I told myself I'd return as soon as the war was over, that I'd find you and explain and ask properly for what I'd already taken. But you couldn't find me. No. Frustration bled into his voice. The frontier is vast, and you'd covered your tracks well. I sent scouts, offered rewards for information, but every lead went cold. And then 3 days ago, I felt it through the bond. Leora's hand moved to her shoulder. Felt what? Fear, yours, so intense it woke me from sleep. Kael turned to face her. I knew you were in danger. I could feel it, but I didn't know where you were or how to reach you. How did you find me then? Commander Sylvain. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. She was supposed to attend the Harvest Festival as my representative. When she left for Ashenvale, I felt the fear spike, so I followed. You followed your own commander. I followed my mate. The words were simple, absolute. I'd follow you anywhere. The bond pulsed warm in Leora's chest, echoing his certainty. She felt the truth of it. He would, without hesitation, without question. But that didn't erase 3 months of silence. You marked me without asking, she said. Bonded us without my consent. I did. You took that choice from me. Yes. Kael moved closer, and this time she didn't step back. I was dying, and my wolf knew you were mine. It reacted on instinct, claiming you before I even understood what was happening. If I could undo it, give you the choice I stole, I would. He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face the way he had on the platform. But I can't, he said. The bond is permanent, unbreakable. And I'm not sorry it exists, only sorry for how it happened. Leora's breath caught. You don't even know me. I know you saved my life when you had every reason to let me die. I know you're strong enough to survive 3 years alone in the wilderness. I know you faced down an entire pack and their allies without flinching. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone. I know that when I was fighting for my life, when I was so close to death, I could feel it pulling me under. The only thing that gave me strength was the bond. Feeling you, knowing you were out there. That's not the same as knowing someone. No, it's not. Kael's smile was rueful. Which is why I'm asking now. Let me know you. Give me the chance I should have asked for 3 months ago. And if I say no, then I'll respect it. The bond stays. I can't change that. But I won't force you into anything else. You can return to the frontier if that's what you want. I'll make sure you're protected, provided for, left in peace. Leora studied his face, searching for deception. She'd spent 3 years learning to read people, to spot lies and hidden agendas. It was a survival skill in a world where trust could get you killed.
But all she saw in Kael's eyes was sincerity and exhaustion, deep, bone-weary exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue. He was a man who'd been fighting for too long and wanted, desperately, to stop. "I don't know how to be a queen," she said quietly. "Neither did I know how to be a king. I inherited a throne at 23 and spent the next 2 years learning by trial and fire." Kael's hands fell to her shoulders, his touch gentle. "We'll figure it out together. Your court will hate me. Your nobles will think I'm unsuitable. My court has hated me for years. One more opinion won't make a difference." Despite everything, Leora felt her lips twitch. "That's not reassuring." "It's honest," Kael sobered. "I won't lie to you, Leora. This won't be easy. There will be people who question your right to stand beside me, who'll say you're too lowborn, too inexperienced, too weak. Just like Darius did." "Yes, but unlike Darius, I see exactly what you are." His eyes held hers. A woman who survived being cast out and built a life from nothing. A healer powerful enough to pull someone back from the brink of death at the cost of her own life force. Someone brave enough to face a crowd of hostile wolves without breaking. He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "You're not weak, Leora. You never were. And anyone who thinks otherwise is going to learn that the hard way." The bond flared between them, warm and insistent. Leora closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She could refuse, could go back to the frontier and live out her days in solitude, connected to him only through the bond she couldn't break. Or she could say yes, could step into a world of politics and power and danger, standing beside a man she barely knew but was tied to in ways she didn't fully understand. Neither choice was safe, but one of them was honest. She opened her eyes. "All right," she said. "I'll try, but I need you to promise me something. Anything. No more disappearing. No more leaving me in the dark." Her voice steadied. "For doing this, if I'm going to be your queen, then you treat me like a partner, not a secret to be protected or a weakness to be hidden. A partner." Kael's smile was slow and genuine. Done. He sealed it with a kiss, softer than the one on the platform, but no less intense. The bond sang between them, and Leora felt something shift. Not just acceptance of what had already happened, but the beginning of something new, something she chose. When they broke apart, Kael rested his forehead against hers. "There's something else you should know," he said. "About Darius." Leora stiffened. "What about him?" "He's requested an audience. Tonight." "What?" She pulled back. "Why?" "He didn't say. But the request came through official channels, which means he wants to make some kind of formal declaration." Kael's expression darkened. "I can refuse if you want. Tell him to handle it through intermediaries." Leora was tempted. The last thing she wanted was to see Darius again, to face the man who'd thrown her away and then tried to use her as a political pawn. But running from him would give him power over her that she refused to grant. "No," she said. "Let him come. I want to hear what he has to say." Kael studied her for a moment, then nodded. "As you wish, but I'm staying with you. I wouldn't have it any other way." An hour later, Darius arrived at the camp. He came alone, without guards or weapons, which was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. Kael's soldiers escorted him to the tent, their hands never far from their swords. When Darius stepped inside, his eyes went immediately to Leora. She stood beside Kael, her hand resting on his arm, the bond mark visible on her shoulder. She'd chosen not to cover it. Let him see what he'd lost. "Your Majesty," Darius said, bowing to Kael. Then quieter. "Leora." "Alpha Cain." Kael's voice was cold. "This is unexpected." "I know, but necessary." Darius straightened, and Leora saw the toll the night had taken on him. His face was drawn, his eyes shadowed. "I came to offer restitution." "For what exactly?" Kael asked. "Imprisoning my mate? Threatening her? Or trying to force her to renounce me?" Darius flinched at each accusation. "All of it. There's no restitution that can undo what you did." "I know." Darius turned to Leora. "Which is why I'm not offering it to him. I'm offering it to you." Leora's breath caught. "What?" 3 years ago, I rejected you in front of the entire pack. I humiliated you, cast you out, let everyone believe you were worthless. His voice was rough. I was wrong, and I'm here to say that publicly. Why now? Leora asked. Because I'm about to be queen? Because it's politically advantageous? No, Darius met her eyes. Because you were right. What you said on the platform, that I was the problem, not you. You were always right. He took a breath. When I rejected you, I told myself it was for the good of the pack, that they needed a strong Luna, someone who could fight and lead and command respect. But the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid of what? Of you. The admission seemed to cost him. You were kind, compassionate. You saw the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. And I knew that if I accepted the bond, you'd change me, make me softer, weaker. So you threw me away. Yes, and I've regretted it every day since. Darius's hands clenched. The pack hasn't thrived under my leadership. We've survived, but we haven't grown. Haven't found the strength I thought we needed. Because strength without compassion is just brutality. He pulled something from his pocket, a folded piece of parchment, and held it out. This is a formal declaration, witnessed and sealed. It states that my rejection of you was based on my own failings, not yours, that you were never unworthy, and that any claims of weakness attributed to you were false. Leora stared at the parchment. You're clearing my name. I'm telling the truth, finally. Darius set the document on the desk. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it, but I needed you to know that I'm sorry, and that I'll spend the rest of my life making sure everyone knows what you really are. Silence filled the tent. Kael looked at Leora, waiting for her response. She picked up the parchment and unfolded it, scanning the words. It was exactly as Darius had said, a formal acknowledgement of his mistake, clearing her of any blame. It was what she'd wanted 3 years ago, vindication, proof that she hadn't been the problem. But looking at Darius now, seeing the defeat in his eyes, she felt something unexpected. Pity. You could have kept quiet, she said. Let me go on to be queen without ever addressing the past. It would have been easier. Easier for me, not for you. Darius's jaw tightened. You deserve to enter the capital with your honor intact, not shadowed by lies I told. Leora folded the parchment carefully and set it back down. I accept your apology, she said. But understand something, Darius. This doesn't undo what happened. It doesn't erase 3 years of survival in the wilderness, and it doesn't mean I forgive you. I know. But... She paused, choosing her words carefully. It means I won't hold it against your pack. When I'm queen, Ashenvale will be treated fairly. No favoritism, but no revenge either. Darius's eyes widened slightly. Thank you. Don't thank me. I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it because those people, your pack, they deserve a queen who sees them as individuals, not as extensions of an alpha who wronged her. She glanced at Kael, who nodded. However, Kael said, his voice hard, there are still consequences for what you did. Imprisoning the future queen, attempting to coerce her, threatening her safety, these are crimes against the crown. Darius straightened. I understand. What punishment do you demand? That's not for me to decide. Kael looked at Leora. It's for her. All eyes turned to her. Leora's mind raced. She could demand anything. Exile, removal from power, public humiliation equivalent to what she'd suffered. The old Leora, the one who'd been rejected and cast out, would have wanted that. Would have demanded justice measured in pain. But she wasn't that person anymore. I want you to do better, she said. For your pack. Find a Luna who complements your strength instead of being a copy of it. Listen to your advisors instead of dictating to them. And when someone shows you compassion, don't mistake it for weakness. She stepped forward. That's my punishment. Live up to the alpha you should have been 3 years ago. Darius stared at her, something like awe crossing his face. Then he dropped to one knee. As you command, Your Majesty. The title sent a shiver through her. It was the first time anyone besides Kael had called her that. Rise, she said, and go home. Your pack is waiting. Darius stood, bowed once more to both of them, and left. The tent flap fell closed behind him, and Leora released a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. That was well done, Kael said softly. Was it? Leora turned to him. Part of me wanted to make him suffer, to take everything from him the way he took everything from me. But you didn't. No, because that would make me just like him. She moved to the tent entrance, looking out at the camp. When I was on the frontier, I learned something. Survival isn't about being the strongest or the most ruthless. It's about knowing when to fight and when to show mercy. Kale came to stand beside her. And which was tonight? Both. Leora leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. I fought by refusing to let him diminish me, and I showed mercy by giving him a chance to be better. The court is going to love you. She laughed, surprised. You think so? I know so, because you just did something I've never managed in 2 years as king. What's that? You gave an alpha who wronged you a path to redemption instead of destroying him outright. Kale's arm wrapped around her waist. That takes more strength than most of my nobles possess. Leora leaned into him, letting herself absorb the comfort of the bond. For the first time since the mark had appeared, she felt settled, grounded. This was right, not perfect, not easy, but right. What happens now? She asked. Now we go to the capital. We prepare for the coronation, and we let the kingdom meet their new queen. Kael pressed a kiss to her temple. Together. The word resonated through the bond, warm and certain. Together. Not alone in the wilderness, fighting for survival, not isolated and rejected, unwanted and cast aside. Together. Leora turned in his arms and kissed him, pouring everything she couldn't say into the contact. The bond flared bright, and she felt his response, fierce and possessive and absolutely devoted. When they broke apart, she was smiling. All right, she said, let's go meet your kingdom. Our kingdom, Kael corrected. As of tonight, it's ours. And for the first time in 3 years, Leora believed in the future. The journey to the capital took 5 days. 5 days of riding through territories Leora had never seen, past villages and towns that grew larger and more prosperous the farther south they traveled. Everywhere they stopped, people came out to see them, to catch a glimpse of the king and the woman he'd claimed. The reactions were mixed. Some cheered, celebrating the news of a royal mating. Others whispered and stared, their skepticism obvious. A few were openly hostile, calling out questions about her lineage, her worthiness, her right to stand beside their king. Leora held her head high through all of it. Kyle had warned her this would happen. The kingdom was still recovering from civil war, still fractured and uncertain. Many of the nobles had supported the rebellion, betting on the coalition to overthrow Kyle. They'd lost, but their resentment remained. And now their king was bringing home a mate none of them had approved, from a background none of them respected. She was going to have to prove herself. Again. The thought should have exhausted her. Instead, it filled her with a strange kind of determination. She'd survived being rejected, survived the wilderness, survived Darius's attempt to control her. She could survive this too. On the 5th day, they crested a hill, and the capital spread out before them. Leora's breath caught. It was massive, 10 times the size of Ashenvale, maybe more. Stone buildings rose in tiers, climbing the hillside toward the palace that dominated the skyline. Walls surrounded the entire city, thick and imposing, with guard towers at regular intervals. This was the heart of the kingdom, and soon it would be her home. Nervous? Kael asked, his horse drawing alongside hers. Terrified, Leora admitted. Good. That means you're smart. He reached over and took her hand. But you're not alone. The gates opened as they approached, and horns sounded, deep, resonant notes that announced the king's return. The streets were lined with people, thousands of them, all craning for a look. Leora felt their eyes on her, weighing and judging. She sat straighter in the saddle and met their gazes without flinching. Let them look. Let them judge. She was done apologizing for existing. The palace gates opened and they rode into a massive courtyard. Servants rushed forward to take the horses, and Kael dismounted, then lifted Leora down beside him. A woman waited at the base of the palace steps, tall and elegant, with silver-streaked dark hair and sharp green eyes. She wore robes of deep crimson, and her presence radiated authority. Your Majesty, she said, bowing to Kael, welcome home. Lady Cassian, Kael's tone was respectful. Allow me to introduce Leora Vance, My mate and your future queen. Lady Cassian's eyes swept over Leora with the precision of a blade. A pleasure, she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. I've prepared the queen's chambers, as requested, though I must say, the timing is unexpected. Most things about our bond have been unexpected, Kael said dryly. Leora, this is Lady Cassian. She oversees the palace and advises the crown on matters of protocol. In other words, she was the gatekeeper to court society. And she was not impressed. Thank you for your preparations, Leora said, keeping her voice level. I look forward to learning from you. Lady Cassian's eyebrow raised slightly. Indeed. Well, the court gathers tonight for a formal reception. I trust you have suitable attire? It was a dig. Leora was still wearing traveling clothes, dusty and road-worn. Before she could respond, Kael stepped in. I'm sure you'll ensure she has everything she needs, he said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. Lady Cassian bowed. Of course, Your Majesty. She turned and swept back into the palace, leaving Leora with the distinct impression that she'd just made her first enemy at court. Kael squeezed her hand. Don't let her intimidate you. She's been trying to run the palace since before I took the throne. She'll test you, but if you stand firm, she'll respect you. And if I don't stand firm? She'll eat you alive. Kael smiled. But you survived the frontier. You'll survive Cassian. Leora wasn't so sure, but she followed him into the palace, her heart pounding and her resolve hardening with every step. This was her life now, and she was going to make it work, no matter what it took. The queen's chambers were vast enough to swallow her entire cabin 3 times over. Leora stood in the center of the main room, turning slowly to take it all in. High ceilings painted with intricate murals of wolves running beneath stars. Windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, overlooking the city below. Furniture carved from dark wood and upholstered in deep blues and silvers. A bed large enough for 4 people, draped in silk that probably cost more than everything she'd owned in her entire life. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. The wardrobe is through there, Lady Cassian said, gesturing to a door on the left. I've had the servants stock it with appropriate attire for tonight's reception and the coming weeks. Alterations can be made as needed. Leora nodded, not trusting her voice. Lady Cassian studied her with those sharp green eyes. You'll want to bathe and rest before tonight. The reception begins at sunset. I'll send attendants to help you dress. I can dress myself. Not in court gowns, you can't. Cassian's tone was matter-of-fact, not unkind. They're designed to require assistance. Laces, clasps, structural elements. You'll need help. The implication was clear. Leora didn't belong here, didn't know the basics of court life. She was right, but Leora lifted her chin anyway. Then I'll learn. Something flickered in Cassian's eyes. Approval? Or amusement at her naivety? Indeed, was all she said. Then she swept out, leaving Leora alone. The silence pressed down like a physical weight. Leora moved to the windows and looked out at the city. From this height, she could see everything, the sprawling marketplace, the residential districts spreading out in neat patterns, the walls that protected it all. Thousands of people lived down there, worked, loved, fought, survived. And soon, she'd be responsible for them. The thought made her dizzy. A soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Enter, she called, turning. 3 young women stepped inside, all wearing the palace livery. They looked nervous, their eyes darting around the room before settling on Leora. Your Majesty, the tallest one said, dropping into a curtsy. The others followed. We're here to assist you. I'm Mira, and this is Denna and Solace. Leora blinked. Your Majesty. Again. She still wasn't used to it. Please, just Leora is fine. Mira's eyes widened. Oh, we couldn't. At least when we're alone, Leora amended. She could see the panic on their faces. In public, I understand the formality is necessary, but here, in private, I'd prefer it. The 3 exchanged glances. As you wish, Mira said carefully. We've drawn a bath for you, and we'll help you dress for the reception. Leora let them lead her to the bathing chamber, another impossibly large room, this one dominated by a sunken tub already filled with steaming water. The scent of lavender and something else, something citrus, filled the air. She'd bathed in a wooden tub for 3 years. This felt obscene, but she stripped and sank into the water anyway, and the heat immediately began unknotting muscles she hadn't realized were tense. The attendants worked efficiently, washing her hair with products that smelled like flowers and left it impossibly soft. They scrubbed away the road dust, the remnants of her life on the frontier, until her skin was pink and clean. When she finally emerged, wrapped in a towel that was thicker and softer than any blanket she'd ever owned, Mira was already laying out the gown for tonight. Leora stared at it. It was stunning, deep midnight blue, almost black, with silver embroidery that caught the light and seemed to move. The neckline was modest but elegant, and the sleeves were long and fitted. "It'll match His Majesty's formal attire," Denna said shyly. "Lady Cassian chose it specifically." Of course she did. Everything at court was calculated, including clothing. It took nearly an hour to get Leora into the dress. See, Mira hadn't been exaggerating. There were laces and clasps and structural elements that required 3 sets of hands to manage properly. By the time they finished, Leora felt like she was wearing armor. Solace worked on her hair, pinning it up in an elaborate style that left a few tendrils framing her face. Mira applied subtle cosmetics, enhancing Leora's features without making her look painted. When they finally stepped back, Leora barely recognized herself in the mirror. She looked regal, elegant, like someone who belonged in a palace, like a queen. "You're beautiful," Mira breathed. Leora touched the mirror, half expecting her reflection to shatter and reveal the truth beneath, a rejected Omega plane dress-up. But the reflection held. A knock at the door. "It's time," Lady Cassian's voice called. Leora took a deep breath and turned away from the mirror. The reception hall was already full when they arrived. Leora stood at the entrance beside KL, her hand resting on his arm, and tried not to let the sea of faces overwhelm her. There had to be at least 200 people here, nobles in their finest clothes, representatives from every major pack, council members and advisors and merchants who'd earned the right to attend court functions. All of them turned to stare as the herald announced their arrival. His Majesty, King Kael Draven, and Lady Leora Vance, the king's mate and future queen. The title hung in the air like a challenge. Kael led her down the center aisle, and the crowd parted. Some bowed. Others simply watched, their expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. Leora kept her spine straight and her expression neutral. At the far end of the hall, a dais held 2 thrones, one slightly larger than the other. Kael led her to the smaller throne and waited until she sat before taking his own seat. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. She was being presented as his equal. Lady Cassian stepped forward, her voice carrying across the hall. "Lords and ladies of the court, honored guests, tonight we celebrate the king's return from the north and the discovery of his mate. Lady Leora Vance has been bonded to His Majesty and will, in 1 month's time, be crowned queen of this realm." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "However," Cassian continued, "as is tradition, the court is entitled to formally acknowledge this bond. Those who wish to offer their support may approach the throne." This was it, the moment where the court would either accept her or reject her. Leora's hands clenched in her lap. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, from the back of the hall, someone stepped forward. Commander Sylvain. She walked to the base of the dais and knelt. "I witnessed the marking," she said, her voice clear. "I saw the bond complete itself. I vouch for its legitimacy and offer my loyalty to the future queen." She stood and stepped aside. Another figure approached, a man Leora didn't recognize, older, with gray in his beard. "Lord Aldrich of the Northern Territories," he said, bowing. "I've heard tales of your work on the frontier, Lady Leora, how you healed those who had no one else. My sister's child was one of them. You saved his life when fever would have taken him. For that, you have my support." He stepped aside. One by one, people began to approach. Some offered support. Others remained silent, watching with calculating eyes. And then a woman stepped forward, who made the entire hall go silent. She was stunning, tall and elegant, with dark hair and ice blue eyes. She wore a gown of crimson silk, and she moved with the confidence of someone who owned every room she entered. "Lady Morgana," Kael said, his voice tight. "This is unexpected." "Is it?" Morgana's smile was sharp. "I wouldn't miss the opportunity to meet the woman who's captured our king's heart." She turned to Leora, and her gaze was assessing, predatory. "You don't look like much," she said. "No offense intended, of course." "None taken," Leora said evenly. "Though I could say the same." Morgana's eyes flashed. "Bold. I like that." She circled the throne, studying Leora from every angle. "Tell me, how does a frontier healer end up bonded to a king? It seems improbable." "I saved his life." "So I've heard. How convenient." Morgana's tone dripped skepticism. "And this bond? It appeared while he was unconscious? Unable to consent?" The hall went deathly quiet. Leora felt Kael tense beside her, but she held up a hand, stopping him from intervening. "Are you suggesting I forced the bond?" she asked. "I'm suggesting it's curious." Morgana stopped in front of the throne. "Royal marks are sacred. They're supposed to form between true mates, chosen by fate. But how do we know you didn't manipulate the situation? Use your healing magic to create a false bond?" "Because that's impossible," Leora said. "Healing magic can mend flesh and bone. It can't forge soul bonds." "So you say. But you're a healer. You understand magic better than most." Morgana leaned closer. "How do we know you're not lying?" Kael stood, power radiating from him in waves. "Enough." Morgana didn't flinch. "I'm only asking the questions everyone's thinking, Your Majesty. If this bond is real, prove it. The mark proves a bond exists, not that it's genuine." Morgana's smile was cold. "There are ways to fake marks. Dark magic, blood rituals. If she's truly your mate, there should be other signs." Leora stood as well, refusing to let this woman intimidate her. "What kind of signs?" she asked. "Shared emotions, the ability to sense each other across distances, a connection that goes beyond the physical." Morgana's eyes glittered. "Can you feel him? Right now? Without looking, without touching, can you tell me what he's feeling?" Leora's breath caught. She could. The bond hummed between them, constant and clear. She felt Kael's anger at Morgana's challenge, his concern for how this was affecting Leora, his absolute certainty in the bond's legitimacy. But admitting that felt like giving Morgana ammunition. "Well?" Morgana pressed. Leora closed her eyes and reached through the bond. "Kael, what should I do?" His response came immediately, not in words but in feeling. "Trust, support, pride. Show them." Leora opened her eyes and looked directly at Morgana. "He's angry," she said quietly, "furious that you'd question our bond in front of the entire court. But he's holding back because he wants to see if I can handle you myself." Morgana's expression flickered. "He's also worried," Leora continued. "Not about the bond. He knows it's real. But about me. Whether this will be too much too soon. Whether I'll break under the pressure." She stepped down from the dais, moving closer to Morgana. "And underneath all of that is exhaustion. Deep, soul-level exhaustion from 2 years of war and politics and fighting just to hold his kingdom together. He's tired, Lady Morgana, and he's hoping, desperately, that I might be someone he can finally trust to share that burden." Silence. Morgana stared at her, and Leora saw the exact moment the woman realized she'd lost. "That's..." Morgana swallowed. "That's very specific." "Because it's true." Leora held her ground. "I don't know what happened between you and Kael. I don't know why you're challenging me, but the bond is real, and no amount of skepticism will change that." Morgana looked between Leora and Kael, then stepped back. "I apologize," she said, the words clearly costing her. "I needed to be certain, for the sake of the kingdom." "Of course you did," Kael said, his tone dry. "Your concern is noted, Morgana. You may return to your seat." Morgana bowed stiffly and retreated into the crowd. Leora returned to her throne on legs that shook, but she kept her expression composed. The rest of the reception passed in a blur. More nobles approached, offering varying degrees of support or neutrality. The court watched everything, weighing and judging. By the time it ended, Leora was exhausted. Kael led her out of the hall and back to her chambers. Once the door closed behind them, she sagged against it. "That was brutal," she said. "That was politics." Kael moved to pour wine from a decanter on the side table. He handed her a glass. "And you handled it perfectly." "Did I?" Leora took a long drink. I feel like I barely survived. You didn't just survive. You won. Kale sat on the edge of the bed, pulling her down beside him. Morgana is one of the most powerful nobles in court. If she'd successfully discredited you, half the others would have followed her lead. But you stood your ground and proved the bond is real. Who is she to you? Kale's jaw tightened. Someone I was supposed to marry before I became king. Leora's stomach dropped. What? It was arranged by our families. A political alliance. He stared into his wine. When I inherited the throne unexpectedly, the engagement became complicated. I broke it off because I couldn't give her what she wanted. Love, partnership. She deserved better than a political marriage. She still wants you. She wants the crown. There's a difference. Kale looked at her. I'm sorry I didn't warn you about her. I thought she'd moved on. Clearly not. No, but after tonight, she'll have to accept that she's lost. He reached over and took Leora's free hand. You were magnificent. The way you read my emotions through the bond, I felt everyone in that room shift their opinion of you. From hostile to merely skeptical, from skeptical to intrigued. Kale smiled. Give them time. They'll come around. Leora wasn't so sure, but she was too tired to argue. She leaned against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart through the bond. This was her life now. Politics and power plays, and people like Morgana who would test her at every turn. But she wasn't facing it alone. Thank you, she said quietly, for letting me handle it myself. You didn't need my help. Kale pressed a kiss to her temple. You're stronger than you realize. The words settled into her chest, warm and certain. Maybe she was. The month before the coronation passed in a whirlwind of preparation, lessons, and careful political maneuvering. Lady Cassian taught Leora court protocol, how to address nobles, which gestures meant what, the 1,000 unspoken rules that governed palace life. Leora absorbed it all with the same focus she'd once applied to learning herbs and remedies. Commander Sylvain taught her self-defense, not because Leora would ever be expected to fight, but because knowing she could gave her confidence. And Kael taught her about the kingdom itself, its history, its territories, the delicate balance of power between the crown and the various pack alphas. She learned quickly, but more importantly, she learned how to navigate the court's treacherous waters without losing herself in the process. When nobles tested her, she met them with calm certainty. When they tried to manipulate her, she saw through it and redirected. And when they offered genuine support, she accepted it graciously. Slowly, reluctantly, the court began to accept her. Not all of them. There were still whispers, still skeptics who believed she'd manipulated her way into the king's bed. But enough of them that when the coronation day arrived, Leora no longer felt like an imposter. She felt like someone who'd earned her place. The coronation was held in the Great Hall, witnessed by hundreds of nobles and representatives from every corner of the kingdom. Leora walked down the center aisle alone. Kael was already on the dais, having been crowned years ago. This ceremony was for her. She wore white and silver, the traditional colors of a queen consort. The gown was breathtaking, covered in embroidery that depicted wolves and stars and the symbols of all the major territories. As she climbed the steps to the dais, she saw faces she recognized. Commander Sylvain standing at attention. Lady Cassian, her expression carefully neutral but her eyes approving. Even Morgana, who inclined her head in acknowledgement. And at the far back, barely visible in the crowd, Darius. He'd come. Despite everything, he'd come to witness this. Their eyes met for just a moment. Leora saw the regret there, the acceptance. He'd lost her, and he knew it, but she also saw something else. Respect. She turned away and knelt before the throne. The high priest, an elderly man with a voice like thunder, raised his hands. We gather today to witness the crowning of our queen. Leora Vance, mate to King Kael Draven, has proven herself worthy through trial and strength. She has faced the court's scrutiny and emerged unbroken. She has earned the right to wear the crown. He lifted the circlet. Delicate silver worked into the shape of wolves and oak leaves. Do you, Leora Vance, swear to serve this kingdom, to protect its people, uphold its laws, and stand beside your king in times of peace and war? Leora's voice was steady. I do. Do you swear to put the needs of the realm above your own? To be a voice, for those who have none, and a shield for those who cannot protect themselves. I do. The priest placed the crown on her head. Then by the power vested in me, I declare you queen of this realm. Rise, your majesty. Leora stood. The hall erupted in applause, not universal, but loud enough that it echoed off the stone walls. Kale stepped forward and took her hand, raising it high. Your queen, he said simply. And this time, when the crowd bowed, it was to both of them. Afterward, in the privacy of their chambers, Kael pulled her into his arms. How do you feel? He asked. Leora considered the question. A month ago, she'd been a prisoner facing execution or exile. A year ago, she'd been alone in the wilderness, convinced she'd spend the rest of her life that way. Now she wore a crown. Like I've come home, she said. Finally. Kael smiled and kissed her, and the bond flared bright between them. In the weeks that followed, Leora began to truly understand her role. She started by doing what she knew best, healing. She established a clinic within the palace, open to anyone who needed help, noble or common, pack or packless. The court physicians were horrified. Queens didn't treat patients themselves. But Leora ignored them. She worked alongside the physicians, teaching them techniques she'd learned on the frontier. She trained healers from across the kingdom, sharing knowledge that had once been closely guarded. And when a plague broke out in one of the southern territories, she went there herself, over the objections of both the court and Kael. You're the queen, he'd argued. You can't risk yourself like this. I'm a healer, she'd countered, and those people need me. What good is a crown if I can't use it to help? She'd gone, and she'd worked until the plague was contained. She'd lost weight, lost sleep, nearly collapsed from exhaustion, but she'd saved hundreds of lives. When she returned to the capital, the story had spread. The queen who'd risked her life for the lowest of her subjects. The healer who wore a crown but never forgot where she came from. The skeptics in court grew quieter. The people loved her. And Leora realized something. She'd spent 3 years surviving, learning to be strong, to stand alone, to fight for every scrap of dignity and worth. Now she could use that strength for something more than survival. She could change things. She started small, improving conditions in the palace for servants and guards, establishing fair wages and reasonable hours, creating pathways for common-born wolves to advance based on merit rather than birth. Then she went bigger. She convinced Kael to reform the laws around rejection. Omegas who were cast out would now receive support from the crown, housing, training, protection. No one would have to face what she had faced. She established sanctuaries for rogue wolves, places where those who'd been exiled could rehabilitate and reintegrate into society. She brought representatives from the frontier territories to court, giving them a voice they'd never had before. Not everyone approved. The traditionalists in court fought her at every turn, but Leora had learned from the best teachers, survival and necessity. She knew how to fight battles, how to choose which hills to die on, how to compromise without losing sight of her goals. And she had Kael beside her, supporting every decision, backing every reform. Together, they reshaped the kingdom. 6 months after her coronation, Leora stood on the balcony overlooking the city and felt the weight of the crown differently than she had on that first day. It no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a tool. Kael joined her, wrapping his arms around her waist. You're thinking loudly, he murmured. I'm thinking about how strange life is. Leora leaned back against him. A year ago, I was alone in a cabin, convinced I'd never matter to anyone. Now I'm standing here, making decisions that affect thousands of people. You always mattered. The world just needed to catch up. Romantic. But she smiled. Do you ever regret it, marking me? Never. His arms tightened. Not even for a second. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me. I'm serious. So am I. Kael turned her to face him. Before you, I was going through the motions, fighting wars, making decisions, trying to hold everything together through sheer force of will. I was surviving, but I wasn't living. He touched her face gently. You taught me there's more to strength than dominance, more to leadership than control. You showed me that compassion isn't weakness. It's the most powerful force in the kingdom. Leora's eyes stung. You're going to make me cry. Good. Cry. You've earned it.
Kael's smile was soft. You came here as a rejected Omega with nothing to prove you deserve to be queen. And in 6 months, you've become more beloved than I've been in 2 years. You've changed laws, saved lives, and shown this entire kingdom what real strength looks like. He kissed her forehead. I'm the one who's honored, Leora, to stand beside you, to call you my mate, to watch you transform not just yourself, but everyone around you. The tears fell then, but they were good tears, healing tears. Leora wrapped her arms around Kael and held on, feeling the bond pulse between them, warm and certain and absolutely unbreakable. She'd been thrown away once, called worthless, weak, unfit. But she'd survived. She'd built herself back up from nothing. And when fate gave her a second chance, she'd seized it with both hands. She was no longer the rejected Omega. She was Queen Leora Draven, and she was exactly where she was meant to be. Below them, the city spread out in the evening light. Thousands of lives, each one precious, each one under her protection. She'd spent 3 years learning to survive. Now she'd spend the rest of her life teaching others that they didn't just have to survive, they could thrive. And so could she. The mark on her shoulder glowed faintly in the dying light, a reminder of where she'd come from and proof of where she'd arrived. From outcast to queen, from broken to whole, from alone to beloved. It had been a long journey, but she'd made it. And this, standing here with her mate, her crown, her purpose, this was just the beginning.